they can catch up. So welcome to this webinar on introducing gold standard for the global goals. I'm going to present for something like 20 minutes to give an overview of the new standard and an overview of some of the strategic priorities we have coming up around demand building and enhancements around the Paris Agreement. I'm going to walk through some slides for that. In terms of housekeeping, I'd love to hear any questions you guys have. You should have a dashboard for GoToWebinar, and you can drop questions into the question box as I go through the slides. I just ask if you do that, please avoid shorthand. And if you want to refer to a specific slide, try and make reference to a slide. That'd be helpful. I can refer back to it that way. There'll also be opportunity for people to submit questions to Gold Standard by email. We're at help@goldstandard.org, and that email address is being specifically monitored for questions about Gold Standard for the global goals. We're responding to those in a really consistent, kind of controlled way, so it might take us a day to respond. But with that, we're going to be recording all the questions and updating the FAQs page of the website as we go along. So with that, I'll dive right in. Gold Standard, welcome to the Gold Standard for the Global Goals presentation. The new standard published on the 10th of July. I'll just show actually my screen briefly. If you haven't already taken a look, I would definitely recommend popping over to the website so you can find the new Gold Standard for the Global Goals microsite in our standard documents. I'd encourage you to have a look around. The standard documents are all in there, along with some support and FAQs, the new fees, terms and conditions, glossary, etc. I'll come back to refer to that in a second. We're actually hosting a series of webinars over last week and this week. So we've already had a couple of webinars for the audit community. This morning GMT anyway, we had a webinar for the project developers, the first of a number for project developers. There'll be more webinars on Thursday this week, specifically focusing on the land use project development side. You can actually listen back to any of those webinars. I'm showing here on my screen the Gold Standard YouTube channel, which I only found out about last week. So apparently some of my presentations are there historically, but you can see all the webinars for Gold Standard for the Global Goals uploads there across the bottom of the screen. So this one will also get uploaded, as will this morning's. We're also going to be scheduling out the questions that are being raised and circulating those around to everybody, so we have a consistent set of answers and everybody can be singing from the same hymn sheet. I think would be great. So as I dive in, I just want to sort of drop some names, I suppose, and say thanks to some of our strategic partners, but really to draw attention to the value add here. We've done a lot of work in Secretariat to strengthen some of our civil society and policy relationships. And that's really not just for our benefit, but really to enhance the credibility of the standard and begin to grow demand that way. So by strengthening the brand, by increasing our visibility and credibility. So we've got some exciting partnerships with the World Bank and Global Alliance. We've strengthened our ties with WWF, and they're involved in several of our new developments. And you will have seen, hopefully recently, we consulted upon a first of its kind collaboration with the UNFCCC, which really has really boosted our recognition in terms of brand and gives us access to some of the policy discussions going on, as well as hearing how we might work with the UNFCCC to develop new tools for different purposes. And I'll come on to some of those. One that we're particularly excited about there is CDP, and we're in discussions with CDP around some of the corporate reporting work that we'll do, which will also hopefully boost demand for a number of our project developers. So I'll come to that later, but suffice to say, we're very pleased with the progress on strategic partnerships and excited to work with some of those names. So I'll dive right into Gold Standard for the Global Goals. We originally developed the concept for the standard as much to unify Gold Standard under a single banner as anything else. So when I started at Gold Standard, we operated 3 or 4 versions of the energy standard and 2 land use standards and a water benefit standard. And all of them included elements that we'd all recognize as Gold Standard, but all articulated in a slightly different way. So the first and foremost benefit of switching to a new standard is to unify that so that Gold Standard means one thing. The gold standard principles mean one thing to everybody, which is really important from a brand strength point of view. And then from a simply operational point of view, what it allows me to do as Chief Technical Officer is manage one standard, which means that when I come to create new efficiencies and higher quality of service, for example, everybody benefits for that, and I can do that once rather than several times, figuring out how to apply it in different contexts. So hopefully over the coming years now, you'll see much more focus from us in terms of some of those efficiency improvements. It takes a bit of work to kind of go back and tidy everything up under one header, but I think you'll find it's worth it in the coming years. There's already some efficiencies generated in gold standard for the global goals, which I'll tell you about shortly. So the standard is what we're sort of terming next generation. There's a next generation standards buzz at the moment. And what that really means is that it's modular, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. We took all the elements that existed in those previous versions of gold standard and separated them out and put them in the right order. So you'll see there the two green boxes on the left, the principles and requirements, and any specific activity requirements. They're the things that all gold standard projects need to adhere to. And that really gives us the core brand and principle of gold standard for the global goals. And then the two blue boxes on the right, really methodologies and products are optional pathways for project developers to seek. Now, I'm sure the astute amongst you have already picked up the tag at the bottom there, which says, if only the left-hand boxes are mandatory, that means gold standard will certify a project just as being a project without the necessity to go on and quantify and issue carbon credits. And you'd be absolutely right in that sense. That is absolutely the intention. And there's a surprising demand for that, just that base project recognition of gold standard. So that is something we'll be offering. But as I say, we'll also be keeping the methodologies and the products that you've already been familiar with. And those will be the pathways that you can continue to use. Just briefly, what's in the core elements. So we looked at the 4 or 5 existing versions of the standard and extracted the 5 principles that really make those up when you really boil it down. And they are contribution to climate mitigation and the SDGs or MDGs in previous versions. There's strong safeguards. There's robust stakeholder engagement. There is a clear and robust certification cycle. And then finally, for projects seeking certain products like carbon credits, there are additionality and ongoing financial need requirements. And I'll come back to some of those in a bit more detail in terms of what's been changed and what's been added. So really those 5 principles are what makes up gold standard for the global goals at its kind of core. On the flexible elements, all the methodologies that you know from previous versions, whichever ones you've been using, are still valid and applicable. They've been transferred across to gold standard for the global goals. There's no need to check if anything's changed in those methodologies. If anything has changed, we'll have told you about that already. So unless you've heard from us that something's changed in the methodology, you can safely assume it's as it always has been. And then the product requirements, really that just lays out how to issue carbon credits, for example, building on my previous note that you're not compelled to do that anymore. That's an option for you, but it's not the only option. That's where those are captured, so in the product requirements. We also then have some new SDG methodologies that you'll be aware of. Our Health A Dailies methodology for cook stoves, black carbon, water. Later this year, we'll be releasing a gender framework as well. I'll just briefly flip back across here to the microsite to explain how that's arranged. So if you look in the standard documents of the microsite, you'll find those modules laid out for you. And you can look at those in turn. So the 000 series is about technical governance. That's really, I would say, an optional read for you. That just explains how gold standard goes about its standard setting activities. It explains how technical decisions are made by our technical advisory committee, etc. So it may well be of interest, but perhaps not the most urgent read if you're interested in the standard. The principles and requirements is one of the mandatory 2 modules I just described. In there, you'll find the core gold standard for the global goals requirements, as well as some of the ancillary requirements like POA or microscale requirements. The 200 series is activity requirements, so specifically providing any deviations, derogations, or additional rules for certain activity types. Not every activity type has anything specific. In the absence of those, you would just use the 100 series, the principles and requirements. But we do have activity requirements for community projects like cook stoves, wash, biodigesters. We have them for grid-connected renewable energy. So if you've developed a large hydro with us, you'll know we have some very specific rules around that. And we do it for land use and forest, so forestry and agriculture. They all have specific activity requirements. And then the 400 is the impact methodologies. As I said, all our carbon credit methodologies are transferred across. And 500 is the product requirements, where you can see how to issue carbon credits or any other product that we develop in the future. The outlier there, which I won't dwell on too much, is contextual requirements. In the contextual requirements, you would find modules that are for very specific aspects of a market or very specific uses. So, for example, here we have gold standard for sustainable urban development. That's a standard for large-scale cities, projects, and programs, really targeted at kind of municipal authorities and large funds, for example. Some of you may well be interested in that, and if so, please do reach out to us. But otherwise, I would say the core principles and requirements, the activity requirements, the methodologies, and the product requirements are the ones you're most interested in as kind of our existing project development community. So I'll just hop back across here to the next slide. Oops, excuse me. So just as a slightly busy slide, but just to show how that pathway might play out for different project types. Working left to right there, the green boxes are mandatory, and obviously the blue, the flexible options. So every project starts with the principle and requirements document on the left-hand side. And then if you have an activity requirements document relevant to what you're doing, you would apply that as well. And as I say, that's really for community, renewable energy and land use projects specifically. And then just taking, say, the cook stoves example here. So you would follow the principles and requirements, the community service requirements, and then you'd have a range of methodologies and potentially products available to you. So right now for cook stoves, we have our existing emissions reduction methodology and the product requirements for carbon credits. And we also have an A-dailies methodology, and you can issue A-dailies through that route. And you can stack those things as well. So if you want VERs and A-dailies from your project, that's totally acceptable. For those of you involved in renewable energy, the standard pathway still applies. So renewable energy emission reduction methodologies and carbon credit product requirements would apply. But we've also just consulted upon the labeling of IREX. So Gold Standard will label IREX shortly. That will publish in mid-August and allow our renewable energy community to take up that option. And we see that as a kind of wide-ranging benefit, really, for the renewable energy projects themselves. There's access to a new market opportunity, and obviously for everybody else, we envisage that as renewable energy projects shift across to that, there'll be some reduced heat in the VER market as well. So really a benefit for everybody. There's no methodology associated with that, since that's just a kind of megawatt hour issuance. There's no calculation involved per se in the labeling of renewable energy certificates. An even busier slide, but this really talks about the new certification cycle. I would say the structure and feel of it will be familiar to existing users already. It's very much based ex-ante and ex-post comparison, as shown here. And there's a few tweaks to terminology that are worth being aware of. So pre-feasibility assessment is replaced by preliminary review. That encompasses what we had in land use and in energy. There's two pathways to listing via preliminary review. One is a very simple desk-based completeness check by Gold Standard. And I would say if you're an energy developer and you've experience of going through that kind of passport check with us, that's kind of how it would feel. It should be a relatively quick and straightforward completeness check process. But we also have another pathway for preliminary review, which is more detailed. For example, where we have a first of its kind project, a very large project, maybe a high risk project in a conflict zone or similar. So we have a kind of preliminary review that can go in that direction too. The outcome of that would be listing. You would then appoint your validator, as you've always done. We use the term GSVVB, so Gold Standard Validation and Verification Body. The reason we've shifted to that is because we acknowledge now more than just DOEs. We also allow for ANSI auditors from the US, for example. In land use, we allow FSC certification bodies. So the catch-all term has become GSVVB for that reason. But validation is still the same step as you've experienced historically. And then with a successful validation, you would enter design review, which results in project design certification. And that's the term that replaces registration. The reason we've changed that term is to try and be a little bit more intuitive as to what the step means. And also we wanted to kind of recognize and celebrate a bit that is a certification step, not just an administrative step, which is what registration sounds like. You may notice there as well that we've reduced what was the registration review from 6 weeks to 4 weeks. So we've found a little bit of efficiency up front there, which will hopefully be a benefit. And then as you slip to ex post, again, you would appoint a GSVVB to carry out your verification as normal, and then we would conduct a performance review rather than an issuance review. That just reflects that not all projects will issue something. So we've changed that language to performance review, but issuance as a step still exists as well. So if you are issuing something, then that's when that happens. There are some tweaks ex post which are worth being aware of. If your project isn't verifying, then we require you to publish an annual report in its absence. That's a very simple step. We're not looking for more than a page, maybe a page and a half, absolute most, on an annual basis. That really just says what the project's been up to. Have you had any inputs from stakeholders? Is anything changing? Do you perceive any risks? There is a template available for that, but you can also use your own template. It's not formally reviewed by Gold Standard. It's not certified. It's really a chance to, for us to know that the project still exists. We have projects that might go several years before a verification. In land use, it's a requirement already for that reason. So really, it's a new step, but I would stress that it's really, really intended to be a very simple step without much work involved at all. And for years, when you verify, you don't need to do an annual report. So when you're verifying, you're obviously providing all that information anyway. If you verify on an annual basis, then effectively you'll never need to do an annual report. And then the other big change is that we shift to a 5-year certification cycle instead of the previous 7 or 10. The reason for that is to come into line with the Paris Agreement policy, which is also a 5-year reporting time frame, primarily. It also kind of accords well with the investment decision making, I think. So it's a 5-year renewal cycle. Unless otherwise stated for specific activities, projects will have one renewal, so a maximum fixed 10 years. We are longer than that for a number of different project types. So renewable energy community projects will be 2 renewals in 15 years. And forestry projects will have the same duration they have now. So a change in timeline there, but reflecting really where Paris is going and trying to get ahead of that curve. At certification renewal, we will require an update to the baseline unless you're a cookstove project, and the proof of ongoing financial need, which I'll come on to in a minute. So there's been some efficiency gains as well. We're pleased to be able to say. I mentioned earlier, and I would stress how important this is as a standards director, is that managing one standard is a lot easier than managing several. So it really means now when we come up with innovations and ways to make things more efficient, everybody can benefit from them. And I don't need to spend as much time thinking through how it applies to each different version of the standard. So I really think that we'll be able to bring more and more of these efficiency gains forward. But there's some already. So I mentioned earlier that we've reduced what was registration review from 6 to 4 weeks. We've also taken the step to only require 1 reviewer instead of 2 when we do a review. So previously, you'll probably be aware that you had two reviewers reviewing your project. Now we've reduced that to 1, unless the project is unusual or very large or high risk for some reason. Typically, it'll be 1 reviewer from Gold Standard. And that allows us to be a little bit more consistent. It allows us to be more resource efficient, and it allows us to kind of generally keep the pace up really of reviewing projects. Some of that came into force actually in April. So some of you will already have seen the benefit of that. Some of you will just be sort of feeling your way into it. But hopefully you'll all start to see how that benefits everybody shortly. Also under one standard, it means that we only need to produce 1 set of training courses and 1 set of guidelines and 1 set of webinars for everybody. So we're hoping to up the amount of support we're able to give more generally within the standard over the coming months. So already we're able to focus on 1 standard rather than several. And then there's some new tools as well. We will be developing a much more comprehensive online platform for Gold Standard for the global goals. But hopefully when you explore the microsite, you'll see that it's already a little bit more intuitive and clearer to follow than the previous versions of Gold Standard, which had sort of dozens of PDFs scattered across several pages. You can download documents from the microsite. There's a little print icon. You can do that. I was asked this morning whether it's possible to download all documents or kind of have a checklist of which ones so you can download them more quickly, and we're going to support that. So that functionality will be added as soon as possible. And then lastly, gold standard cookstove IQ is coming soon. That's an IT platform for the users of the cookstove emissions reduction and ADALIS methodologies, which allows you to input your monitoring information and have the calculation taken care of for you in a much quicker, more consistent way. So hopefully reducing the number of errors, making projects more comparable, making it easier for you to complete your PDD. There's also going to be a first of its kind of SDG reporting mechanism within that as well for cook stoves. And we really hope to kind of push and develop that in the coming months and years. So that IT platform for cook stoves will come online around the end of August and will be available to all of our cook stove users. And even if you're not a cook stove user, it might be worth taking a quick look at that, because you'll kind of get an impression of the direction of travel for some of those IT efficiencies. So on to some of the key changes within the standard. I won't take too long over this, because obviously you can read these for yourself in the FAQs. But just quickly by principle. So if you're a version 2.2 user, you'll know that you had to issue carbon credits, which represented climate mitigation, and you had to positively contribute to 2 MGGs. The new requirements are actually very similar, certainly no more onerous. We require you to contribute to 2 SDGs, and to 3 SDGs, and one of them must be SDG 13, representing climate. So really, the net effect is neutral there. You'll have the same amount of contributions as before. I suppose the major difference is that you don't have to issue carbon credits to achieve SDG 13 contribution. Safeguarding principles have replaced do no harm assessment. I know at first glance that document looks kind of weighty and lengthy and a little bit daunting. But I would say please do try to get used to it, because there's some actual efficiency gain there as well. We've done some kind of desk-based testing, and although there's a 20+ overall requirement sections, for each individual project type, it's highly likely you won't have any more sections than you did under the do no harm assessment. So for example, when we ran it for wind projects, I think there was something like 10 or 11 sections that were mandatory or relevant. For cook stoves, it was circa 10, 11 again. So really, I think there were 11 do no harm principles. It's very similar in terms of that. And then you've got the extra requirements if there's something unusual about your project. It really kind of unifies the consistent approach to gold standard. And the requirements are more detailed, so that makes for a lengthier document, but I think it also helps with some clarity. So it should be easier to understand what we mean by some of those safeguards, whereas the do no harm assessment, there's been countless discussions over whether they've been met or how to interpret them properly. So hopefully when you get used to those safeguards, you'll see the benefit of the extra weight of document there. Stakeholder consultation hasn't changed massively. There's probably 2 things to draw your attention to. One is that we now require projects to consider affected stakeholders as well as local. I would say largely most projects won't have much more to do there, but there are projects that affect stakeholders outside their boundary. You could imagine a large agriculture project that draws a lot of water in a watershed, for example, or if you've got people outside your project boundary that are making use of resources within it, perhaps that's something to think about. So it's really just trying to make sure we're being more holistic. But I suspect in many cases there won't be too much more to do there. And the other addition to the stakeholder consultation we're really excited about is we've added some requirements and some guidelines around greater gender sensitivity in stakeholder consultation. So taking better account of women's issues and the challenges particularly women might have in attending or contributing to the stakeholder process. Men also, clearly, obviously, but a key focus here is women's engagement in the process. So that does require a little bit of extra thinking time on the behalf of project developers, but I would hope you could all agree that the reason for doing that and the benefit that brings everybody is worthy and worth taking the time to figure out. Demonstrating real outcomes is really the certification cycle I just showed you. So the same requirements for MRV, third-party audit that we've always had, with some tweaks to timelines and terminologies. And then the last principle, financial additionality. So I mentioned earlier that not all projects will need to prove this. So if you're a project that's not seeking the issuance of carbon credits, for example, then we're not going to ask you to prove financial additionality. We don't require financial additionality in the renewable energy labels, although there's an option to prove that because certain parts of that market want that. But for the usual products that people are used to, like carbon credits, financial additionality still stands, and we'll continue to make use of the CDM tools in that sense. So you'll be using the same tools. There's some tweaks to deemed additionality for community projects that are worth reviewing in the activity requirements. Nothing too onerous, so I don't think it takes away anything that people had before, but some tweaks to explain that a little better are worth reviewing. And we also introduce a new concept called ongoing financial need. And the idea with ongoing financial need is when you come to certification renewal, the project will demonstrate that it still needs gold standard finance. So what we found, certainly with certain renewable energy markets, for example, is a 3 times 7 year renewal cycle actually is quite long, and some of those markets are transformed and those projects are profitable and viable on their own merit. And so what they do by taking carbon credits is effectively divert carbon credit monies from projects that still really need it. And so that's the idea of introducing ongoing financial need. Now, again, certain projects will have very little difficulty in proving that test. I can imagine some of the least developed countries, some of our community projects really won't have any challenges with that in reality. The ongoing financial need requirements are actually going to be consulted upon in Q3, and I'll come on to that in the second part of my presentation. But again, hopefully everybody understands why we've introduced that. That's really a best practice thing that we want to innovate on, and I suspect the market will follow us in that direction in due course. And there's a change to who is eligible to audit your projects. In the short term, nothing changes, but I'll explain a little bit about this process for your own benefit. If you're interested in learning more, the VVB webinars are up on the YouTube channel, and there's a VVB requirements document in the 100 series on the microsite. But in a nutshell, we are going to add an approvals process to VVBs. So an auditor will now have a recognized accreditation like DOE status, and then they'll apply to join the gold standard community. And they'll do that by proving their competence, their team structure, they're signing up to our legal agreements and entering into performance monitoring with us. We've never done that before. We've always been a little bit sort of one step removed from the audit community in that sense. We have no relationship with the UNFCCC in that regard, for example. And so we really wanted to change that. We are looking to join the ICORE Alliance, which some of you may have heard of, which is a standard for standards. Fair Trade are a member, FSC are a member, and that requires us to have better structures for who can audit gold standard projects. I think the value to project developers there will be that the auditors that are in the gold standard community have taken a positive decision to be in that community, rather than kind of drift into it because they're just eligible because they hold a recognized accreditation. So it should make it a more positive change. By managing that under one standard and being able to charge a small fee, we can improve the quality of our training, and the performance monitoring will start to lead to higher quality audits, which in turn should lead to less review time by gold standard. That's what we really hope to achieve here. In the short term, nothing changes. If you're undergoing validation or verification right now, there's no change. Your verifier can complete that work. The change comes after the 1st of November. So by the 1st of November, VVBs will have to apply to continue with us. So anything you want to enter into after the 1st of November, there will be a list of those that have made their application. To reassure you, there'll be no gap between the two. You won't find yourselves in a position where there's nobody available. We had actually something like 75 auditors turn up to the VVB webinar, and we've had an overwhelmingly positive response. So at the moment, touch wood, we're fully expecting continuity of full continuity of service. We're actually expecting some new VVBs to come online as well to increase competition and give you guys more choice. But we'll monitor that closely, and obviously if those assumptions prove to be wrong, then we'll adjust and make sure that the audit community is still fully available to you. And some upcoming milestones for projects. You may have read in the various communications that we do expect and require all projects to transition to gold standard for the global goals. There's two main reasons for that. One you've already heard is that it really helps us to manage only one standard because we can be more efficient for all of you. But there's a technical reason too. If you're registering under 2.2 right now, that means theoretically in 2027, you could still be reporting against the Kyoto Protocol and the Millennium Development Goals, which is obviously farcical given that the Sustainable Development Goals will be coming up to completion by that date. So by the time you've converted to the new language, we may as well convert you to gold standard for the global goals. The process we're going to try and keep very simple. It's a process between the project and gold standard. It won't increase your auditor's fee. The auditor won't be any part of that. It will involve the submission of some information via some kind of template checklist to gold standard. We'll review and discuss it with you and take a decision to approve you. Because the standard already includes many of the same elements from previous versions, we're really not expecting many projects to have any difficulty with transition. It's really a kind of sense check and helping you convert the language to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, rather than a kind of real thorough line by line check against the standard. So I appreciate it must sound daunting to have to transition, but we're really hopeful that process will be simple and we'll be able to help you through that process. Hopefully you can see the value of that decision. So the standard published 10th of July, that's what you saw on the microsite. It comes into effect on the 14th of August. That's when you can choose to use gold standard for the global goals for any new project that you're working on. The reason we've got this kind of two-step approach there is the exact reason of this webinar, actually. We wanted to have a period between the two that people could review the documents, ask questions. We could share some more information with you and show you what we're working on. So from the 14th of August, you can choose to put a new project through gold standard for the global goals. The next important date is the 1st of November. Anything that is in the gold standard process, i.e. has been submitted for PFA or is listed or is undergoing validation, is registered, has verified several times, anything that's in the gold standard process under version 2.2 or earlier can continue to register under that version if it's submitted before the 1st of November 2017. So if you already started with us, let's say you're in validation right now, you can complete your validation and register under version 2.2 and transition later. You can transition at the same time if you choose to, but you don't have to. That really gives you a grace period, I think, before having to do a load of work to transition later on. After the 1st of November, new projects must use gold standard for the global goals. So if it's a new project from scratch, never submitted to gold standard, after the 1st of November, it must be gold standard for the global goals. So just to reiterate, if you're in the process before the 1st of November, you can continue to register under 2.2. If that process takes longer than the 1st of November, that's totally fine. So if you're validating right now and you expect to register in January, you would register under version 2.2. That's totally fine. So if you've got any concerns at all about where you are in the process and what you would need to do, which auditor you would have to use, please do reach out to us, help@goldstandard.org. We've really designed these dates to avoid anybody having to suddenly change gear or fill out a load of new documents that you didn't expect to have to do. So if that's not working for you, we'll look to adjust it so it does. And then the last important date is the 1st of March 2018. So that's the date after which all existing projects must transition to gold standard for the global goals. And you'll do that at the next available verification or certification renewal. So you don't have to transition on the 1st of March. If your next verification is in January 2019, that's when it'll happen. That's totally fine. So there's a bit of time there, I think, to get used to the requirements. And as I say, that transition doesn't involve the auditor. There's no need to be paying more to the auditor, for example, to do that. That's really a process between you guys and the gold standard. So hopefully you can understand the rationale of requiring transitions. Hopefully you can understand the rationale of the grace periods. But I do appreciate the dates take a little bit of getting your head around. There's questions like, what does it mean if I'm retroactive? What if I land on the day, for example? How does that work? If you've got any concerns at all, how does it affect my project? Please do reach out to us, help@goldstandard.org, and we'll talk you through it. So just some short notes to draw your attention to. I would say it's worth obviously getting used to the new standard itself, but the activity requirements for community projects and for renewable energy projects also include some changes. For example, we're going to allow renewable energy projects to issue both VERs and gold standard labeled IRECs. That's something we've not been able to do before, but we're really excited about. We're going to, there'll be a maximum certification period of 15 years instead of the default 10. There's some new definitions around microscale and deemed additionality for those projects that you might want to take a look at. Generally, you'll find a lot of the requirements are very familiar at the activity level with some minor tweaks. If you're not sure how to apply them, do let us know. We're happy to talk you through that. There's some changes to land use projects as well. I'll flash them up on the screen here. This isn't really a webinar for land use developers. There are 2 webinars on Thursday for land use. If you'd like to hear more, you're welcome to join those or reach out to us to discuss. And I wanted to just wrap up this presentation by spending a short period of time telling you what we're planning to do next on the gold standard strategic development front. So obviously we've just published the standard and we're gearing up to smoothly operate that new standard, and that's a big part of our focus. But gold standard is an innovating platform, and we are coming forward with new innovations. And really this, just to explain why we're doing that and where the kind of focus is, we really want to make sure that gold standard is relevant post 2020. The SDGs are interesting and put a really useful platform, but I don't expect there to be such a policy position on that, kind of like the Paris Agreement. I don't see a Paris Agreement equivalent developing. But in carbon and the carbon markets, the Paris Agreement is a huge deal that we need to better understand as policy updates and is agreed, but also try to get ahead of, to future-proof, to give more options to developers to make sure that we kind of ride that wave. Without, I certainly don't want to sound alarmist here. We really see the Paris Agreement as a fantastic opportunity, but we also see that there are some kind of problematic areas for the voluntary carbon markets that we need to overcome. We also want to build demand for carbon credits and other emission reduction related products. And there's some new areas of funding that we're hoping to leverage as well within the SDGs, but other markets too. And then lastly, reducing complexity and cost of certification. You can expect to see a lot more from us in the coming years on that as we start to consolidate under one standard. So what's coming up next? So in Q3 this year, I guess we're already in Q3, so in the coming months, you'll see some consultations around beginnings of how to future-proof against the carbon markets coming forward. So one thing we're looking at, for example, is a study and new guidelines into double counting post-2020. So that'll be an analysis of the nationally determined contributions and figuring out where different project types fit in different countries and whether there's a double counting problem. Are you counted in the national inventory? Is the country signed up to allow the transferal of carbon credits? So we're really going to investigate that in a lot more detail and come out with new guidelines around the NDCs. We're also going to be looking at additionality requirements for different project types. So likely to update our additionality requirements for renewable energy, grid-connected renewable energy, as that becomes a more transformative market. And we'll look at work with our stakeholders on defining what ongoing financial need means. So we've purposely not fully defined ongoing financial need in the standard because no project will be applying it yet for a couple of years at least. So there'll be an opportunity to feed into that, what that means as well. And the last part of this is that we're looking to see how gold standard might label some of the new market schemes coming forward. For example, could we label Chinese CERs? Is that something that there's demand for? How straightforward would that be to do? So if you see a labeling opportunity for gold standard for your projects in your domestic markets, wherever your projects are, then we'd be very interested to hear from you as a case study to see what might work and what we could do there. There's a series of new applications for the standard coming up. Now we have this modular standard. It means we can innovate much more quickly. And the purpose of those innovations is to find new areas of finance, new markets for projects. So some of the new environmental markets, for example, we're entering the renewable energy certificate space. We'll also be looking to develop results-based finance mechanisms in carbon. So looking at statements of emissions reductions for projects that exist in places where double counting is a problem and there's no way out of that post 2020. We'll explore how statements of emission reductions can be used for results-based finance as well. We see that starting to develop at some of the other standards. I think BCS are looking at a similar concept. So that may well be something that comes forward in the next few years. Corporate reporting is something we're very excited about. There's a number of corporates that have supply chain projects in the gold standard portfolio and are kind of forced down a route of issuing carbon credits when in fact what they're really looking to do is report on their scope 3 emissions under the GHG protocol, so the emissions from their supply chain. So we're looking to create a module for those corporates to be able to quantify their emissions reductions programs in their supply chains and use that in a CDP context. So if you're a project that happens to be kind of corporate related or could be of interest to corporate supply chain work, I think that'll be a great avenue for you. It'll also take some of those projects out of the carbon market itself, so they won't be competing with that kind of project. And then some of the large scale developments, there's one thing we're exploring is we have some very, very promising conversations, and I don't want this to sound abstract, some very promising conversations with some large results-based finance development funds, impact investment funds that are looking to fund profitable projects and want to use gold standard for the global goals as the MRV/due diligence/monitoring and evaluation protocol for their funds. And so that's really exciting because I think it offers two things. It means their projects will improve naturally, but gold standard projects could potentially apply to be invested in by those funds. So having already achieved gold standard certification, I think that puts projects in a great position to already be eligible for those funds. So we're hopeful that there's some funds that will just use gold standard for the global goals for that process. And I think as that kind of skill set and that brand recognition develops, some other funds will start to recognize, there's big funds out there that may not ever, exclusively use gold standard for the global goals, but some of them may well recognize it and have that avenue for you. So that will take a little bit of time to embed, but I'm genuinely hopeful and excited that will come forward. So just some upcoming milestones before I finish the presentation. As I said, project transitions to gold standard for the global goals commence March 1st, 2018. New projects have to use gold standard for the global goals from the 1st of November. They can use it from the 14th of August. And any existing projects or projects at any stage really under version 2.2 can continue to register under version 2.2 if they were submitted to us prior to the 1st of November. We're going to be releasing a gender responsive framework in October. That's to allow the quantification of gender positive impact. So on SDG 5, I suspect that will involve things like quantifying women's economic empowerment, for example. There are pockets of market interest in that. So some people will fund gender impacts directly. Some of those impact investment funds may well require it as a kind of access point. So people will want that. And then I think there are some carbon credit buyers. I know some of the governments in Europe, for example, I think the government of Luxembourg are likely to focus on gender issues and may well use that as a kind of gateway quantification to pay a premium for carbon credits. So that's exciting. That's coming later in the year. As I said, we're going to consult upon additionality and ongoing financial need. We'll be closely monitoring the Paris Agreement and more actively involved. You'll see some innovations around the NDCs there. So if that's an interest area for you in terms of the technical aspects of that, and you'd like to monitor that process, please do reach out to us. There'll be consultation on that too. But if you've got a skill, expertise, experience, or interest in that, then happy to hear from you. I mentioned ICEAL. We'll be applying to ICEAL in late 2017, early 2018, when we've fixed where the kind of future direction of our certification approach is going. ICEAL, I suspect, doesn't have a direct effect on project developers' everyday lives, but it will increase the visibility and the credibility of gold standard massively. So it means we're among the standards like those big names, FSC, Fairtrade, and we can coordinate and partner with those standards much more easily to give you access to some of their markets, which is very exciting. There's a real dearth, I think, in ICEAL standards for the quantification of SDG impact, and that's really what we hope to add to the piece. Our kind of founder, WWF, has insisted now for a couple of years that we move to ICEAL membership from a credibility perspective. So that's exciting. And then lastly, there'll be some new SDG tools and methodologies. So some of the methodologies you've seen, like our health methodologies, we're also going to develop a slightly kind of lower level of rigor, kind of SDG compass tools for different project types. So I'm aware under 2.2 that it's not always very attractive to show positive contribution to more than the required amount of Millennium Development Goals, because that's extra monitoring. So what we want to try and do is create the tools where that monitoring is very simple and it can celebrate those SDG contributions without you creating extra work by doing so. So look out for those in the coming months. So that's really it. I hope that's given you a good overview. I forgot to mention at the start that there's going to be a technical training webinar that goes into much more detail on the technical side of the standard, and that's around the 2nd of August. So you should receive an invite to that shortly if you haven't already. That will also be recorded for you to listen back at your leisure. More detailed technical questions you can submit anytime to anybody you know at Gold Standard, so whoever your contacts are, and we have the help desk, help@Gold Standard, that can help with that as well. So do take time to familiarize, and then if you have any questions, then please do reach out. And so if anybody has any questions, pop them in the question section of the dashboard. I see one already, which I'll answer briefly shortly. If anybody has any others, do leave them in there. Otherwise, like I say, reach out to us after. So thank you very much. We have one question which I'll read out and respond to. So what exactly does transitioning mean for existing projects? If not new documentation, is it a new monitoring template? Also, what about the do no harm? Do we have to retool this to reflect the template for safeguarding principles assessment? The first thing I would say to take a look at, if you haven't already, if you go to the 100 series on the microsite, there's a document that explains the transition process. It's a gold standard for the global goals transition requirements. If for some reason you can't find it, let me know. When we circulate the notes of these webinars, I'll add the link to the circulation email as well. But that really explains to you what documentation is required and how the process works. But to specifically address the question, we're looking to keep as much of your existing documentation as possible. We don't want people to have to transfer PDDs or monitoring templates, for example. I think the big changes will be that how do we take your Millennium Development Goal contributions and translate those to the language of the SDGs? Some of that will be, semantics. Some of that will be a little bit more in depth as we figure out with you exactly where those should fit. So that's probably the number one change for everybody. Then in terms of safeguards against the do no harm assessment, or maybe stakeholder first is a good example, you clearly can't go back and do your original stakeholder consultation again. And so we won't be doing anything particular there. So you won't have to review that. You won't have to update your documentation to do that. And really the same sort of principle applies with the safeguards. So I would say largely we'll leave it with the do no harm assessment and deem those to have met the new requirements, with the exception, I suspect, with specific project types might have some specific stuff to address. So we're aware that some of the safeguards, for example, are supposed to be addressed at the start of the project. So, for example, the gender safeguard, the water safeguard, after the fact, you can't go back and do those. And we know you can't meet that requirement, and so we won't be imposing it. So we're not going to ask you to update your do no harm assessment to demonstrate how you meet every safeguarding requirement. It'll be more like a review and a sense check and a gap check with you to decide if there's anything you could be doing, anything that you should be doing to update to latest best practice. But it's really only going to be stuff that you can do. So anything that's where the opportunity was missed, you obviously can't go back, and we won't enforce that. I think on the safeguard side, to answer the question specifically, in most cases, I don't think there'll be much to do there. Most of the safeguards have more detail, but are broadly the same principle of what you had in the do no harm assessment. There might be one or two examples where we've had to introduce a new best practice for a certain activity type, and we really want you to look at that. But I would say, in the case of cook stove projects or biodigester projects, I would envisage, expect there to be minimal transition between do no harm and safeguarding principles assessment. But do take a look at that transition requirements document. We are going to be issuing a template checklist for people to use to fill out more easily. But I would stress that the watchword here is to keep things as simple as possible with the transition, because we don't want existing projects to feel like it's hard to transition, that you're not already gold standard in some way. That's really not the intention here. It's going to be kept as simple as possible because you're already gold standard projects. It's not like you're coming in from a different standard. So hopefully that helps. I'm happy to have a conversation on that, Esther, when the time comes, if it's helpful. Maybe review those documents and we can arrange a call to go through that in a little more detail as you need. Hopefully that's helpful. There's no other questions in the dashboard there, so I'll leave it open for a few seconds as I sort of say my thanks. If anything pops in, I'll answer it. I see another question's popped up there. Great. So if a VVB is already a DOE, will it be very simple to become a VVB, almost a rubber stamp? Yes, in a nutshell, that's the idea, particularly if they've got some experience of gold standard already. So really what we're asking them to do is just show us their team, show us that they've got the experience, and to enter into the performance monitoring. So a very simple process. It would involve a submission of an application, a desk-based review by gold standard, a brief review period for our technical advisory committee to raise any concerns, and then, as you say, a rubber stamp. So a very quick process that we're envisaging there. And it just gives us the opportunity, if somebody's coming in from the cold with a very small team with no experience really of the types of projects that we're interested in, that we can we can either reject that or put it into some kind of special measures. But I think also, we really want some new VVBs to be available to you guys as well. So the ANSI VVBs in the US, which might be of interest to you guys on the call, the ANSI VVB community is going to have access to this as well. And we've got a lot of interest from those guys wanting to apply to gold standard. Interestingly, it seems that some of our non-traditional auditors are interested in getting our approval because there isn't any other SDG accreditation schemes for auditors out there at the moment. And so although we're not an accreditation body, having gold standard approval is kind of like having something like CDP accreditation. It gives you access to a different kind of conversation, I think. So fully expecting that list to grow, but yeah, very simple process overall. Okay, great. Well, thank you for those questions. There were some more questions asked this morning's webinar, which you might want to read through. As is always the way when you do the second webinar, you kind of answer those questions as you go through the presentation. So there's always less questions the second time around, but do take a flick through those communications. The next step from us, you'll see an email come out from us in the next week or so, which will include links to the YouTube webinars that you can take a look at. I'll highlight the link to some of the critical documents like the transition requirements and activity requirements should you need them. But if you can't find those in the meantime, then do drop us a line and we can point you to those. And then we'll also circulate the schedule of questions that we've been asked at these webinars as well, so that you can read through what others have been asking and you can see our kind of consistent responses to those too. So really just left to say thank you so much for joining. Thank you for supporting the process. It's been long. We've had 90 days of consultation, 2.5 years of technical working groups, and numerous presentations at COP conferences, conversations with stakeholders that have really helped us shape this new standard. I know it's daunting taking on a new standard and transitioning to a new standard, and we're definitely here to help that. But I really hope you can see some of the benefits of doing that, and I think you'll feel them more and more in the coming years as we build demand in the carbon markets and put ourselves in a more secure position for post 2020. So with that, I say thank you very much for joining. Do reach out to me with any questions. I think you've all got my email address. But if not, help@Gold Standard is the main port of call for any specific technical questions because we can record those and be consistent with our answers. So have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining and look forward to hearing your views in the next few weeks. Thanks, guys.